The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 4. The Discovery of the Nation Soul. Therefore, in nations so circumstanced, this tendency of self-finding has been most powerful, and has even created in some of them a new type of national movement, as in Ireland and India. This and no other was the root meaning of Subjectivism in Bengal and of the Irish movement in its earlier, less purely political stages. The emergence of Bengal as a sub-nation in India was throughout a strongly subjective movement, and in its later development it became very consciously that. The movement of 1905 in Bengal pursued a quite new conception of the nation, not merely as a country, but a soul, a psychological, almost a spiritual being, and even when acting from economical and political motives, it sought to dynamize them by this subjective conception, and to make them instruments of self-expression rather than objects in themselves. We must not forget, however, that in the first stages these movements followed in their superficial thought the old motives of an objective and mostly political self-consciousness. The East, indeed, is always more subjective than the West, and we can see the subjective tinge even in its political movements, whether in Persia, India, or China, and even in the very imitative movement of the Japanese resurgence. But it is only recently that this subjectivism has become self-conscious. We may therefore conclude that the conscious and deliberate subjectivism of certain nations was only the sign and precursor of a general change in humanity, and has been helped forward by local circumstances, but was not really dependent upon them, or in any sense their product. The general change is incontestable. It is one of the capital phenomena of the tendencies of national and communal life at the present hour. The conception to which Ireland and India have been the first to give a definite formula, quote, to be ourselves, end quote, so different from the impulse and ambition of dependent or unfortunate nations in the past, which was rather to become like others, is now more and more a generally accepted motive of national life. It opens the way to great dangers and errors, but it is the essential condition for that which has now become the demand of the time spirit on the human race, that it shall find subjectively, not only in the individual, but in the nation and in the unity of the human race itself, its deeper being, its inner law, its real self, and live according to that and no longer by artificial standards. This tendency was preparing itself everywhere and partly coming to the surface before the war, but most prominently, as we have said, in new nations like Germany, or in dependent nations like Ireland and India. The shock of the war brought about from its earliest moments an immediate, and for the time being a militant, emergence of the same deeper self-consciousness everywhere. Crude enough were most of its first manifestations, often of a really barbarous and reactionary crudeness. Especially, it tended to repeat the Teutonic lapse, preparing not only to be oneself, in quotes, which is entirely right, but to live solely for and to oneself, which, if pushed beyond a certain point, becomes a disastrous error. For it is necessary, if the subjective age of humanity is to produce its best fruits, that the nations should become conscious not only of their own, but of each other's souls, and learn to respect, to help, and to profit, not only economically and intellectually, but subjectively and spiritually by each other. The great determining force has been the example and the aggression of Germany. The example, because no other nation has so self-consciously, so methodically, so intelligently, and from the external point of view, so successfully sought to find, to dynamize, to live itself, and make the most of its own power of being. Its aggression, because the very nature and declared watchwords of the attack have tended to arouse a defensive self-consciousness in the assailed, and force them to perceive what was the source of this tremendous strength, and to perceive, too, that they themselves must seek consciously an answering strength in the same deeper sources. Germany was, for the time, the most remarkable present instance of a nation preparing for the subjective stage, because it had, in the first place, a certain kind of vision, unfortunately intellectual rather than illuminated, and the courage to follow it, unfortunately again a vital and intellectual rather than a spiritual hardihood. And secondly, being master of its destinies, was able to order its own life so as to express its self-vision. We must not be misled by appearances into thinking that the strength of Germany was created by Bismarck or directed by the Kaiser Wilhelm II. Rather, the appearance of Bismarck was in many respects a misfortune for the growing nation, because his rude and powerful hand precipitated its subjectivity into form and action at too early a stage. A longer period of incubation might have produced results less disastrous to itself, if less violently stimulative to humanity. The real source of this great subjective force, which has been so much disfigured in its objective action, was not in Germany's statesmen and soldiers, for the most part poor enough types of men, but came from her great philosophers, Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Nietzsche, from her great thinker and poet Goethe, from her great musicians Beethoven and Wagner, and from all the German soul and temperament which they represented. A nation whose master achievement has lain almost entirely in the two spheres of philosophy and music is clearly predestined to lead in the turn to subjectivism, and to produce a profound result for good or evil on the beginnings of a subjective age. This was one side of the predestination of Germany. The other is to be found in her scholars, educationists, scientists, organizers. It was the industry, the conscientious diligence, the fidelity to ideas, the honest and painstaking spirit of work for which the nation has been long famous. A people may be highly gifted in these subjective capacities, and yet if it neglects to cultivate this lower side of our complex nature, it will fail to build that bridge between the idea and imagination and the world of facts, between the vision and the force, which makes realization possible. Its higher powers may become a joy and inspiration to the world, but it will never take possession of its own world until it has learned the humbler lesson. In Germany, the bridge was there, though it ran mostly through a dark tunnel with a gulf underneath, for there was no pure transmission from the subjective mind of the thinkers and singers to the objective mind of the scholars and organizers. The misapplication by Tretzky of the teaching of Nietzsche to national and international uses, which would have profoundly disgusted the philosopher himself, is an example of this obscure transmission. But still a transmission there was. For more than a half-century, Germany turned a deep eye of subjective introspection on herself and things and ideas in search of the truth of her own being and of the world, and for another half-century a patient eye of scientific research on the objective means for organizing what she had or thought she had gained. And something was done, something indeed powerful and enormous, but also in certain directions, not in all, misshapen and disconcerting. Unfortunately, those directions were precisely the very central lines on which to go wrong is to miss the goal. It may be said, indeed, that the last result of the something done, the war, the collapse, the fierce reaction towards the rigid, armored, aggressive, formidable Nazi state, is not only discouraging enough, but a clear warning to abandon that path and go back to older and safer ways. But the misuse of great powers is no argument against their right use. To go back is impossible. The attempt is always, indeed, an illusion. We have all to do the same thing which Germany has attempted, but to take care not to do it likewise. Therefore we must look beyond the red mist of blood of the war, and the dark, fuliginous confusion and chaos which now oppress the world, to see why and where was the failure. For her failure, which became evident by the turn her action took, and was converted for the time being into total collapse, was clear even then to the dispassionate thinker who seeks only the truth. That befell her which sometimes befalls the seeker on the path of yoga, the art of conscious self-finding, a path exposed to far profounder perils than beset ordinarily the average man when he follows a false light to his spiritual ruin. She had mistaken her vital ego for herself. She had sought for her soul and found only her force. For she had said, like the Asura, quotes, I am my body, my life, my mind, my temperament, end quotes, and become attached with a titanic force to these. Especially she had said, quotes, I am my life and body, end quotes. And then that there can be no greater mistake for man or nation. The soul of man or nation is something more and diviner than that. It is greater than its instruments, and cannot be shut up in a physical, a vital, a mental, or a temperamental formula. So to confine it, even though the false formation be embodied in the armor-plated social body of a huge collective human dinosaurus, can only stifle the growth of the inner reality and end in decay or the extinction that overtakes all that is unplastic and unadaptable. It is evident that there is a false as well as a true subjectivism, and the errors to which the subjective trend may be liable are as great as its possibilities, and may well lead to capital disasters. This distinction must be clearly grasped if the road of this stage of social evolution is to be made safe for the human race.